The cabin was located at the end of a narrow dirt path, about 15 miles from the nearest town. When I arrived, the silence was striking. It wasn't the usual stillness, but a heavy quiet, as though even the air held its breath. The only noises were the crunching leaves under my boots and an occasional bird call. It was peaceful, yet unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. I chalked it up to nerves. I'd lived in the city my whole life, and this kind of isolation was new to me. During the first few days, I focused on clearing out debris left by the previous owner. Piles of old tools, broken furniture, and other useless items. I hauled it all out and burned it in a pit I dug behind the cabin. The work was exhausting, but there was a strange satisfaction in seeing progress through my own efforts. By the end of the first week, the cabin was empty, and I started on repairs. The roof had holes, the floorboards groaned underfoot, and the windows were nothing more than jagged gaps. But I was determined to make it livable. It was during the second week that I noticed the carvings. I had started stripping the walls to replace the rotting planks when I found them. Tiny, detailed patterns carved into the wood. They were everywhere, covering nearly every surface of the cabin. At first, I thought they were random marks, but as I examined them, I realized they were intentional. Most of the designs were geometric shapes, triangles, spirals, and interlocking lines, but some depicted animals or plants that didn't look familiar. The areas around the carvings felt smoother, almost polished, as if someone had carefully worked on them. I didn't think much of it. Maybe the former owner was an artist or simply bored in the middle of nowhere. The carvings had a strange beauty to them, and I decided to leave them. They added a unique character to the cabin. About a week after discovering the carvings, the noises began. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, I heard it, a low, rhythmic creak, like footsteps on old wood. I froze, holding my breath. The sound came from the porch, slow and deliberate, as though someone was pacing back and forth. Grabbing a flashlight, I peered out the window, but saw nothing. The forest was still, shadows stretching long under the moonlight. I told myself it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sound persisted for hours before I eventually fell asleep out of exhaustion. The next morning, I checked outside but found no tracks or signs of anything. Over the following days, I started to notice changes in the carvings. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the patterns shifted. New lines appeared, and shapes transformed subtly, almost imperceptibly, until they looked entirely different. One evening, I examined them closely with a flashlight. The wood under my fingers felt soft, almost like skin. When I pressed on one carving, the surface gave slightly, then sprang back as if alive. Startled, I pulled my hand away, heart pounding. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the mind. Then the smell began, a faint, sour odor that grew stronger over time. Thinking a small animal had died under the cabin, I crawled beneath to investigate. What I found churned my stomach. A heap of bones, small ones, possibly from birds or rodents. They were clean, but not old. Bits of tissue clung to them, and the smell was overwhelming. I backed out, deciding to deal with it later, but the next morning, the bones were gone. The sounds returned, more frequent and louder. Scratches, thuds, and even whispers. Sleep became impossible. I wanted to leave, but something held me back. Stubbornness, pride, or perhaps sheer foolishness. I couldn't abandon the cabin just yet. One night, everything escalated. I woke to a deep groaning noise, as if the cabin itself was alive and moving. The walls trembled, and the carvings seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light of my flashlight. The floor beneath me shifted, and I scrambled to my feet. Dark liquid began seeping from the carvings, pooling on the floor. The stench of decay filled the air. Panic took over. I grabbed my bag and fled, not looking back. I drove straight into town and never returned. Later, I heard the cabin had been destroyed in a fire, though I sometimes wonder if that's the whole truth. Even now, the images linger in my mind. The carvings, the pulsing walls, and the way the cabin seemed alive. I don't know what was in that place, and I never want to find out. I had found the cabin through a listing online. The description was minimal. A few blurry pictures, a short note about its remoteness and appeal for hikers or hunters, and a clear warning that there was no cell reception. That suited me perfectly. After the non-stop rush of city life, I craved a complete disconnect. I imagined spending my days hiking the trails and my nights by the fireplace, lost in the pages of a good book. The drive consumed most of the day. The farther I went, the narrower the roads became and the towns grew scarcer. With every mile, the weight of daily stress seemed to lift. By the time I turned onto the unmarked gravel path leading to the cabin, a sense of calm had started to settle over me. The road wound through low hills, with the tires kicking up fine dust as I drove cautiously. But as soon as the cabin came into view, my mood shifted. The cabin looked like the photos, a modest wooden structure with a slanted tin roof. But something about seeing it in person was different. The dark windows reflected the surrounding trees like black mirrors, and the front porch leaned just enough to make me question its stability. It seemed aged and neglected, as if it had stood untouched for decades. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and stepped into the stillness. No birds called out, no leaves rustled, just the faint murmur of wind weaving through the trees. Shaking off a twinge of unease, I grabbed my bag and reminded myself I was just tired from the drive. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the air inside was thick with the scent of smoke and dust. The cabin's interior was simple. A single main room with a small kitchenette in the corner, a table with two mismatched chairs, and a worn couch. A narrow doorway led to a bedroom with a tiny bathroom beyond it. Everything was functional but felt oddly out of place, as though it hadn't been used in years. Still, I chalked it up to my imagination and began unpacking. The first night passed without incident. I started a fire in the stone hearth, had a quick meal, and read until I drifted off. The wind howled as I lay in bed, rattling the windows and seeping through unseen cracks. I reassured myself that old cabins were bound to be drafty and noisy and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I set out to explore the area. The land around the cabin was rugged, a mix of rocky outcrops and scruffy trees. The trails were poorly marked, but I had a map and a compass, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. Hours passed as I wandered, savoring the earthy scent of pine and the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots. I didn't see another soul, which was exactly what I'd wanted. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, something felt off. The front door was slightly ajar, enough to catch my attention. My chest tightened. I was sure I had locked it. My first thought was that a stray animal had wandered inside, but when I stepped through the doorway, everything was exactly as I had left it. My bag was untouched, the counters were bare, and the couch hadn't been disturbed. I checked every corner, even under the bed and inside the closet. Nothing. Trying to dismiss my unease, I double-checked the lock and spent the evening convincing myself it had been a mistake. But that night, the uneasiness grew. I woke several times, each time certain I'd heard something outside. The crunch of gravel, the creak of wood. Each time, I held my breath, straining to hear more. The sounds never came again, but by morning, I was restless and on edge. On the third day, I ventured farther, hoping the hike would calm my nerves. I packed a light lunch and followed a dry creek bed that led deeper into the hills. The landscape became harsher, the trees thinning to reveal jagged rocks and open sky. It was starkly beautiful, but as the hours passed, I started feeling watched. It was subtle, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, a sense of being followed. I stopped frequently, scanning the rocks and trees, but saw nothing. When I reached a ridge overlooking the valley, I froze. There, in the dirt, were footprints. They weren't mine. The tread was different, and they were larger than my boots. Worse, they looked fresh. The edges of the prints were crisp, leading away from where I stood. I followed them briefly, my heart pounding, until they disappeared into a cluster of rocks. I didn't dare go further. I turned back, walking quickly but resisting the urge to run. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the clearing. I locked the door and secured the windows, checking each latch twice. That night, the noises started again. Footsteps on the porch, the faint scrape of something against the wood. I stayed motionless in bed, clutching the flashlight I had brought, my ears straining for every sound. Hours dragged by before silence finally returned. In the morning, I found scratches on the front door, deep, jagged marks as if something or someone had tried to get in. My stomach churned as I stared at them. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed up quickly, all the while feeling as if unseen eyes were watching me. As I stood on the porch, ready to leave, I glanced back at the woods. That's when I saw it. A figure standing among the trees, half hidden in the shadows. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. My chest tightened, and I scrambled into the car, starting the engine with shaking hands. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. Only then did I check my phone, finding dozens of missed calls and messages. Apparently, the area I'd been in was notorious for strange disappearances and eerie sightings. I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I'm certain of one thing. I wasn't alone out there, and whatever was watching didn't want me to stay. It was the winter of 2016, and I was stationed in a secluded cabin deep in the Wyoming wilderness. My mission was straightforward: observe, report, and, if necessary, neutralize any threats to the sensitive project I was monitoring. The cabin was isolated, perched precariously on the edge of a rugged hill overlooking a snowy valley. The frigid air, deafening quiet, and utter loneliness would have been unbearable for most people, but solitude was where I thrived. The cabin itself was Spartan. It had been constructed for one purpose: long-term surveillance. The wood was rough and unpolished, the small windows fortified with thick shutters to block the icy winds. Inside, the essentials included a narrow cot, a wood-burning stove, a simple table, and my equipment. My rifle, scope, and a stockpile of rations were my lifelines. The radio remained silent unless I needed to check in. Radio silence was part of the protocol. I had been there for nearly a month, keeping tabs on a man named Daniel Carver. Carver was no ordinary target. Once part of the military, he had been dishonorably discharged under suspicious circumstances. Rumors swirled about his involvement in smuggling operations, but what concerned us was his connection to dangerous people. My task was to watch for any signs of meetings or illegal activities in the area. Most days were uneventful. I would scan the valley below with my scope, occasionally spotting wildlife or the rare stray hiker. Nights were harder. The cold seeped into my bones despite the stove, and the darkness felt suffocating. Often, I sat on the porch in full gear, rifle across my lap, to remind myself I wasn't helpless. In the fourth week, things changed. One morning, as I made my usual rounds to check the cabin's perimeter, I found a set of boot prints in the fresh snow. They led up the hill to the west but stopped abruptly near the tree line. My pulse quickened. I hadn't heard anyone approach, which should have been impossible in such silence. Returning to the cabin, I locked the door and checked my rifle. Everything appeared normal, but my instincts were on high alert. That night, I couldn't sleep, The following morning, the tracks were gone under a fresh layer of snow, but the pile of firewood by the porch had been scattered deliberately. My gear was untouched, yet the unease was overwhelming. Someone had been here. I spent the day vigilantly scanning the surroundings, but the forest and valley betrayed nothing. Then, one night, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic crunch of snow underfoot, starting far off and gradually drawing closer. I extinguished the stove, plunging the cabin into darkness, and waited by the window, rifle at the ready. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Hours passed without another sound. The next day, I found more tracks circling the cabin, closer this time. Whoever it was had been watching me through the night. Over the next few days, I set up simple traps, tripwires and noisemakers, not to stop anyone, but to provide warnings. For 3 days, nothing happened. I began to think the intruder had moved on. Then, one of the traps triggered just after sunset. A tin can clattered loudly. I rushed to the window but saw nothing. An hour later, another trap went off at the rear of the cabin. They were testing me, wearing me down. The following night, they grew bolder. While cleaning my scope at the table, I heard a soft tapping on the window behind me. My blood froze. The windows were too high for anyone to reach without equipment. Yet when I turned, nothing was there. No tracks in the snow, nothing disturbed. They weren't trying to break in. They were playing with my mind. By the end of the week, I was barely sleeping. My food was running low, and the cold felt harsher. Each night, multiple traps went off, but I never caught a glimpse of anyone. On the 9th day, I made a decision. I wouldn't wait any longer. That morning, I packed my gear and followed the tracks that had appeared overnight. They led me up the ridge, deep into the forest, but abruptly ended in a clearing. No camp, no signs of life, just silence. Scanning the area, I spotted a metallic glint high in the trees. Aid in camera. They had been watching me all along. The realization hit hard. This wasn't random. It was calculated. I turned back, but the forest felt oppressive, every sound amplified. By the time I returned to the cabin, night was falling. I locked the door, shut the heavy shutters, and prepared for the worst. That night, the siege began. Traps triggered in succession. Footsteps circled the cabin. The walls groaned, and the soft tapping on the windows returned. Just before dawn, a gunshot shattered the silence. The bullet pierced the wall, missing me by inches. I fired back blindly, and the footsteps retreated. When daylight came, I ventured outside. The snow was stained red, and a trail led into the trees but disappeared before I could follow it far. I never saw who it was or what they wanted. Extraction arrived 2 days later, finding me out of supplies and barely coherent. I reported everything, but they found no evidence, no tracks, no cameras, nothing. To this day, I don't know who it was, but I know one thing: they were better than me, and that knowledge keeps me awake at night. It was the winter of 2015, and I was stationed in a secluded cabin deep within the Wyoming wilderness. My mission was straightforward: observe, report, and, if required, neutralize any threats to the sensitive asset under surveillance. The cabin was isolated, perched precariously on the edge of a rugged cliff that overlooked a desolate valley. The cold, the quiet, and the solitude were enough to unnerve most people, but I thrived in it. The cabin was bare bones, designed purely for utility, a monitoring station built for prolonged observation. The walls were rough, untreated timber, and the windows were tiny with thick shutters to block out the piercing wind. Inside, there was a simple cot, a wood-burning stove, a small table, and my equipment: a rifle, a scope, and provisions to last for weeks. The radio was my sole connection to the outside world, but protocol required keeping it off except for scheduled check-ins. I had been there for nearly a month, keeping tabs on a man named Samuel Wright. He was no ordinary individual, former military, dishonorably discharged under circumstances shrouded in secrecy. Rumors hinted at involvement in smuggling weapons and narcotics, but what truly alarmed us were his connections. Dangerous connections. My orders were to monitor for any sign of suspicious activity, whether meeting with someone or moving illicit goods through the area. For the most part, my days were uneventful. I spent hours scanning the valley through my scope, occasionally noting a stray hiker or wildlife. Nights, however, were a different story. The cold crept into every corner of the cabin, and no amount of wood fed to the stove seemed to keep it at bay. The oppressive darkness outside felt suffocating, and I often sat on the porch, rifle in hand, just to remind myself I was in control. Then, during the fourth week, things changed. It began with tracks in the snow. During my morning perimeter check, I noticed fresh footprints leading up the ridge to the west. My pulse quickened. I hadn't heard anyone approach, which was almost impossible in such quiet surroundings. Crouching low, I followed the trail until it vanished into the dense forest. Whoever it was had come too close only to retreat. I returned to the cabin, locking the door and meticulously inspecting my rifle. The scope was clear, the barrel was cool. I positioned myself by the window, keeping a watchful eye on the ridge. Hours passed without any sign of movement, and by nightfall, I had almost convinced myself it was a lost wanderer. Still, I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the footprints were gone, buried under a new layer of snow. But something else was amiss. The small stack of firewood near the porch had been scattered, not accidentally but deliberately. My gear appeared untouched, yet the undeniable sense of being watched consumed me. I spent the day scouring the valley and tree-lean through the scope, my eyes burning from the strain. Still, there was nothing. Whoever had approached was clever, skilled enough to avoid detection. That night, the first sound came, a slow, rhythmic crunch of footsteps in the snow. It started faintly near the ridge and grew louder. I extinguished the stove, plunging the cabin into darkness, and waited by the window, rifle at the ready. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and I stayed frozen, listening, for what felt like an eternity. Morning revealed fresh tracks circling the cabin. Someone had been watching me all night. Now on high alert, I set simple traps around the cabin, tripwires and makeshift noisemakers. They wouldn't stop anyone, but they'd give me a warning. For 3 nights, nothing happened. Then, just as I began to lower my guard, the traps started triggering. The first was a clatter of a tin can against the cabin wall. Rifle in hand, I scanned outside but saw nothing. Hours later, another went off at the rear. They were testing me, wearing me down. The next night, they became bolder. While cleaning my scope at the table, a faint tapping came from the window behind me. My blood froze. The windows were too high for someone to reach without aid. Spinning around, rifle ready, I saw nothing. The snow outside remained undisturbed. Checking the doors and windows, I found everything secure. It dawned on me then they weren't trying to break in. They were toying with me, aiming to fracture my resolve. By the week's end, I was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and nearly out of supplies. The traps went off every night, sometimes multiple times. I never caught a glimpse of anyone but constantly felt their presence. Finally, I decided to act. At dawn, I packed my remaining gear, checked my rifle, and followed the fresh tracks that had appeared overnight. The trail led me up the ridge and into the forest. Hours passed as I trudged through the snow, unease growing with every step. The tracks ended abruptly in an open clearing. No camp, no signs of activity. It was as if the person had vanished. As I scanned the area, my scope caught a glint of metal high in the trees. Camera. They'd been watching me all along. Heart pounding, I turned back toward the cabin, but the forest now felt alien. The silence was suffocating, and every step seemed to echo ominously. By the time I reached the cabin, night was falling. I secured the door, shutters, and rifle, knowing the encounter wasn't over. That night, the cabin came under siege. Traps triggered in rapid succession. Footsteps circled the building, and soft tapping echoed from the windows. As dawn approached, a gunshot shattered the tension. The bullet tore through the wall, narrowly missing me. I fired blindly into the dark, hearing retreating footsteps before silence resumed. Daylight revealed blood in the snow, leading to tracks that vanished into the woods. I called for extraction, but it took 2 days for the team to arrive. By then, I was out of food, ammunition, and sanity. I recounted everything, but no evidence remained. No tracks, no camera, no sign of my tormentors. To this day, I don't know who they were or what they wanted. But one thing haunts me: they were better than I was, and that thought keeps me awake every night. I wasn't exactly thrilled when my manager, Lisa, announced that our small work group was heading to a remote lodge in the hills for a creativity retreat. I nodded along like the diligent employee I aimed to be, but deep down, I was dreading it. Lisa had a knack for pushing us into uncomfortable situations in the name of personal growth. Saying no wasn't an option, not if I wanted to keep my job. The lodge was roughly 2 hours outside of Boulder, tucked deep into the foothills of the Rockies. It was advertised as a modern retreat. No Wi-Fi, minimal cell reception, but plenty of inspiration from nature. Lisa booked it through a private rental site that promoted it as ideal for team-building exercises. Personally, it sounded more like a nightmare. I'm a city person at heart, used to coffee shops, bustling streets, and high-speed internet. Not seclusion in the wild with my boss. We arrived on a chilly Friday in late October. The air was crisp, and patches of frost clung to the forest floor. The road winding up to the lodge was narrow, flanked by towering pine trees that seemed to loom closer the farther we drove. The rental SUV I was driving struggled over the uneven terrain, and I couldn't shake the feeling of the forest closing in on us. The lodge itself was stunning. A sleek, 2-story wooden structure with massive windows offering a view of the valley below. It was modern but still blended seamlessly with its natural surroundings. Lisa, ever the optimist, marveled at the breathtaking views and excitedly predicted how productive we'd be over the weekend. I mustered a smile and hauled my bag inside. Inside, the lodge was just as impressive as it was outside. Polished wooden floors, a towering stone fireplace, and a kitchen outfitted with state-of-the-art appliances. The upstairs had 4 bedrooms and a spacious living area with plush seating and a large table. It was the sort of place people would pay handsomely to rent for vacations, but all I could think about was how isolated it was. Remote didn't even begin to cover it. My phone had lost signal about 20 minutes before we arrived. Lisa assured us there was a landline for emergencies, but we were otherwise cut off from the outside world. As the sun set behind the hills, the temperature dropped quickly. We started a fire in the massive hearth and settled in for the evening. Lisa handed out the weekend's itinerary, brainstorming sessions by day and team bonding activities at night. The whole plan reeked of corporate jargon, but I bit my tongue. That night, sleep didn't come easy. My room was at the far end of the hall, and the stillness of the lodge was suffocating. Every creak of the wooden floorboards and every gust of wind rattling the windows felt amplified in the silence. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard faint footsteps outside my door. When I worked up the courage to peek into the hallway, it was empty. The next day, we dove into our brainstorming sessions. Lisa was in her element, leading discussions and jotting notes on a portable whiteboard she'd brought. I tried to focus, but something about the lodge felt off. Little details didn't seem to add up. For one, the landline. Lisa had mentioned it on arrival, but when I tried to use it on Saturday morning, it was completely dead. I brushed it off as an old system, but it unsettled me. Then there were the noises. At first, I chalked it up to the forest, branches cracking or wildlife moving about. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard something heavier. Slow, deliberate footsteps circled the lodge. My mind raced. Could have been an animal, but it sounded unmistakably human. Summoning courage, I peeked through the curtains, but the night was too dark to see anything. The following morning, I mentioned the noises to Lisa. She laughed it off, saying it was probably deer or some other wildlife, but I noticed her smile falter. She kept glancing at the windows, as if she, too, was uneasy. Later that day, I decided to clear my head with a walk. A narrow trail behind the lodge led to a small creek. The fresh air was calming, but as I ventured farther, I noticed how unnervingly quiet the forest was. About half a mile from the lodge, I stumbled upon a peculiar clearing. In the center was a makeshift fire pit, surrounded by small, crude wooden structures. They were too small to be shelters. Scattered around were strange items: a torn scrap of fabric, an old shoe, and what appeared to be the rusted blade of a knife. A chill ran through me, and I hurried back. That night, things came to a head. After dinner, as we sat by the fire, the power abruptly cut out. At first, we thought it was a blown fuse, but the breaker box showed no issues. The lodge was plunged into near-total darkness, lit only by the flickering firelight. Lisa lit some candles, but the tension in the room was palpable. The quiet was shattered by a loud thud from upstairs. We froze, staring at each other. Another thud, louder this time. It came from my room. Flashlights in hand, we cautiously made our way upstairs. My heart raced as I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the window was wide open. Muddy footprints led from the window to the door and back out. They were human and fresh. We didn't sleep that night. We barricaded the doors and windows as best we could, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, we hastily packed and left without a word. Lisa kept glancing in the rearview mirror during the drive back, as if expecting someone to follow us. A week later, Lisa called me. She'd looked into the lodge's history and discovered it had belonged to a solitary man who vanished a decade ago. His body was never found, but hikers in the area occasionally reported eerie encounters. Footprints in the snow, missing items, and glimpses of a figure in the trees. I haven't been back to the mountains since. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear those footsteps outside my door. I was 28 when my fiancée, Sarah, suggested we take a weekend trip to a secluded cabin to unwind and step away from our hectic schedules. It was mid-October 2020, and the cool breeze hinted at the arrival of winter. We found the cabin on a rental website, a small, isolated place tucked deep into the forests of central Vermont. It was described as rustic yet cozy, ideal for couples looking to disconnect. On the surface, it seemed perfect. No nearby neighbors, no cell service, and nothing but wilderness surrounding it. A perfect escape from the noise of our daily lives. I had been putting in long hours at my carpentry job, while Sarah's late-night shifts at the clinic often left us with little time to connect. A quiet weekend sounded like just what we needed. Without hesitation, I booked the cabin. The drive ended up taking longer than planned, partly because the directions from the owner were vague, and GPS had trouble with the winding back roads. By the time we turned off the main road onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, the sun was sinking below the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the trees. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as we drove deeper into the forest. The further we went, the denser the trees grew, their branches knotted together like a canopy that blocked out most of the fading light. When we finally arrived, The cabin was undeniably charming in its simplicity. It had wooden siding, a steeply sloped roof, and a stone chimney from which faint wisps of smoke were curling. A surprise since the owner hadn't mentioned anyone being there before us. Sarah reasoned it was just a sign the place had been prepared for our arrival. We also noticed a small shed nearby and an old, weathered pickup truck parked beside it, which I assumed belonged to a caretaker or cleaner. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt as though we had stepped into another world, one entirely disconnected from civilization. We carried our bags inside, and the first thing that hit me was the stale, earthy scent. While the cabin wasn't dirty, it had the kind of musty odor you'd expect from a place left vacant for long stretches. The furniture was basic: a worn fabric couch, a simple wooden dining table, and a pair of chairs near a stone fireplace. Above us, a loft with a mattress and blankets was accessible via a narrow wooden ladder. The kitchen was functional but minimal, featuring an old propane stove and a compact fridge that emitted a soft hum. Despite its simplicity, the cabin had a cozy vibe, and Sarah seemed excited. She began lighting candles and unpacking while I went outside to gather firewood. That's when I noticed something strange. Behind the shed was a neat stack of logs, but it wasn't the woodpile that caught my attention. It was the faint metallic odor hanging in the cool evening air, something unsettlingly reminiscent of blood. I shook off the thought, attributing it to damp wood or the peculiar way the forest seemed to trap smells. Grabbing a few logs, I headed back inside, dismissing the unease. After dinner, we sat by the fire, the soft crackling of the logs mingling with the occasional gusts of wind outside. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the sense that something felt off. The isolation of the cabin, which had seemed so appealing before, now felt almost oppressive. I chalked it up to tiredness from the drive and let it go. Sarah eventually dozed off on the couch, but I stayed up a little longer, staring into the fire and listening to the faint creaks of the cabin. Just as I was about to head to bed, a soft, rhythmic tapping broke the silence. It wasn't coming from inside but from outside, near the window. My body tensed as I froze in place, every nerve on edge. I told myself it had to be a branch brushing against the glass. The wind had picked up after all. But when I got up to check, there was no branch near the window. In fact, the nearest tree was too far to make that kind of noise. I glanced outside into the darkness, but the forest offered nothing but shadows. Trying to shrug off the unease, I returned to the couch. Then it happened again, the same deliberate tapping, this time from the back of the cabin near the kitchen. It sounded too purposeful to be random. Not wanting to alarm Sarah, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to investigate. The night was cold and unnervingly still as I swept the flashlight beam across the area. The shed, the woodpile, and the surrounding trees revealed nothing unusual. There were no tracks, no signs of wildlife, nothing that could explain the sound. Feeling unsettled, I went back inside, locked the door, and checked the windows before heading to bed. Sarah stirred as I climbed into the loft, but I didn't tell her about the noise. I didn't want to worry her. The next morning, the forest felt strangely calm, as though the unnerving events of the night had been erased. Sarah suggested we go for a hike, so we packed some snacks and followed an overgrown trail behind the cabin. About half a mile in, we stumbled upon an old campsite. A stone fire pit filled with ashes sat amid rusted cans and debris. While the site seemed abandoned, something felt off. The ashes in the fire pit weren't as old as the rest of the setup. They looked fresh. Sarah didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't shake the unease as we continued. When we returned, I noticed another disturbing detail. The door to the shed, which had been shut the day before, was now slightly open. Curiosity mingled with dread as I approached. The metallic odor I'd noticed earlier was stronger now, almost overpowering. Inside, the shed was cluttered with tools, paint cans, and a dusty workbench. But in one corner, beneath a tarp, lay something large. Hesitant but unable to stop myself, I lifted the tarp and froze. Beneath it was the mutilated carcass of a deer, its ribs exposed and flesh shredded, not by an animal but by something with precision. The cuts were clean, too clean. I stumbled out of the shed, my stomach churning, but didn't share what I'd seen with Sarah. I didn't want to ruin the weekend, though I knew something was very wrong. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. It moved from one window to the next, circling the cabin. Sarah woke up, her face pale with fear. We clung to each other as the tapping persisted, only to stop suddenly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Summoning courage, I grabbed the fire poker and went downstairs. The front door was locked, but the kitchen window was open a crack. I closed it, checked the other windows, and climbed back into the loft. Sarah pointed to the loft window, now slightly ajar, though it had been shut earlier. It was too small for anyone to climb through, but the sight sent chills down my spine. Somehow, we made it through the night. At dawn, we packed and left in a hurry. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin and saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. To this day, I don't know who or what it was, but one thing is clear: we weren't alone in that cabin.